I used to think my reading problem was about discipline, so I tried everything from waking up early, reading more pages, and forcing focus, but none of it lasted. And I recently figured out why. And it wasn't a discipline problem at all, actually. It was a self-trust problem. So in this video, I'm gonna show you exactly why that happens and the shift that finally made reading feel sustainable instead of exhausting. And the strange thing is, the problem wasn't really even about reading. It was actually happening in the background of everything that I did. I've constantly made these plans for myself that sound really good in the moment. Things like, I'm gonna read every night, or I'm gonna wake up early and work out. And sometimes I'd actually follow through for a few days, but eventually I'd fall off. And that cycle would repeat. And after doing that enough times, I stopped feeling confident in my own ability. Not because I was lazy, but because my brain had collected all this evidence that I don't actually follow through consistently. And this is the thing nobody talks about when it comes to reading specifically. Because reading isn't physical, it's mental. And the moment your brain stops trusting yourself, it quietly resists the thing that requires the most mental energy. Your habits don't just affect your results, they affect your identity. Every time you repeatedly ignore your own commitments, you slowly stop seeing yourself as someone reliable. And that changes the way you approach everything, especially reading. Because reading requires consistency, and consistency requires self-trust. This is why motivation feels so temporary. Motivation can start a habit, but self-trust is what sustains it. Because when you trust yourself, you stop negotiating with every decision. You simply do what you said you were gonna do. So instead of trying to become the perfect reader overnight, focus on rebuilding positive evidence. Small things like read a few pages, or read for 10 minutes, or read just one chapter. Not because small goals are magical or anything, but because kept promises are what rebuild identity. So pick one thing and do it tonight. That's the whole move. But there was another thing secretly making reading harder for me. And honestly, I think this is what destroys consistency for a lot of people. I realized there were a lot of days where I genuinely wanted to read, but I had already ruined my focus before I even sat down. Doing things like spending too much time on my phone, too much switching between tasks, and too much mental noise. Then at the end of my day, when I tried to read, it wouldn't work. And I would blame myself for things like lack of discipline. But the real issue was that my environment was constantly draining the energy that was required for deep focus. For me, lack of discipline was actually unmanaged mental exhaustion. Reading is hard when your brain is overstimulated all day, because books are competing against things like short-form content, notifications, and constant stimulation. So if your brain is constantly scattered, reading is gonna feel painful. And here's where this connects back to self-trust. Every time I told myself I'd go to bed at a decent time and I didn't, there was another broken promise, which meant less energy the next day, which made it harder to follow through on anything else, including reading. So the overstimulation wasn't just draining my focus, it was feeding the same cycle of distrust I was trying to break. I kept trying to force consistency while living in a way that made consistency impossible. So instead of trying to push harder, I started protecting my energy. So I started with a consistent bedtime, reduced my mental clutter from things like the news, drama, and trying to cut down on my social media use, and less overstimulation before reading. Within about 2 weeks, I noticed I was actually looking forward to sitting down with a book. And weirdly enough, reading became easier without having to force it. But the biggest mistake I used to make with reading was what happened after I fell out of the habit. So this was probably the biggest realization for me. Every time I missed a few days of reading, I treated it like failure. And the longer I put off reading, the harder it felt to come back. Not because reading itself was hard, but because having to restart made me feel guilty. Like I was turning back into the person who couldn't stay consistent. So instead of restarting right away, I would just avoid reading altogether, which only made things worse. Consistency isn't about never falling off, it's about returning back to the thing quickly. The people who are successful at building a reading habit are not perfect. They just don't turn every setback into an identity crisis. All or nothing thinking can destroy consistency, because the moment that you miss a day, your brain creates this story that you're falling off again. And once that story starts, you're gonna quit emotionally before you quit physically. You may have even felt this before and talked yourself out of coming back to the habit too. That's the real problem, not the missing days. This is why weekly reading goals help me a lot, because instead of obsessing over perfection every single day, I focused on jumping back in quickly. And if I missed a day, that was fine. And I would just restart and come back to the situation with no guilt, not really giving any attention to the fact that I was restarting. Just return and do the thing. There's no need to spiral, because rebuilding self-trust matters more than maintaining a perfect streak. What I had to learn is that reading was never really the problem. Self-trust was, and you rebuild that the same way it's broke, one small decision at a time. But even after I became more consistent with reading, there was still another problem. I would finish books and barely remember anything from them. So in this video right here, I'm going to show you the simple reading comprehension system I started using to actually understand and remember what I read. Keep learning, keep growing, keep going. And I'll see you in the next one.